If figures are true, then they'll likely count as one of the most shocking statistics of the entire war. Slightly over a week ago, on July the 12th, the British Ministry of Defense released an update on recent Russian casualty numbers in Ukraine. While the MOD is obviously and openly backing Kyiv in the fight, its information also tends to be broadly accurate. It was British intelligence, after all, that was among the first to predict the Russian invasion before it even happened. Well, if the numbers they put out on July 12th are even close to broadly accurate, then they constitute some pretty sobering news for the Kremlin. According to the MOD's report, Moscow's forces lost 70,000 men over the months of May and June this year, the highest casualty rate on the Russian side for the entire war. To be clear, this number is for casualties rather than only those killed. While it will include soldiers who've died in battle, it'll also include those that are missing, captured, or too badly wounded to continue fighting. Still, it remains a staggering figure, almost equivalent in size to the entire British Army. It's also higher than we'd previously seen in this bloodiest of wars. Not even the battles of Bakhmut or Avdiivka generated so many casualties among Moscow's forces. Now, if you've watched our previous videos on the subject, you'll already be aware that estimates of Russian losses can vary wildly. And while the MOD figures were backed up by American intelligence, leaking to the New York Times in May that Moscow's forces were suffering over 1,000 casualties a day, we can't guarantee that they're completely accurate. For this segment, though, let's try and take the MOD's report as a good faith attempt to produce a number reasonably close to the truth. If that's the case, then the major question we need to ask is, what's driving this trend? Now, one obvious reason for a spike in Russian deaths would be the new front near the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. On May the 10th, a large assault began on Ukrainian positions that led to some rapid early gains before Kyiv's forces were able to shore up their defenses. Given that an attacking force almost always suffers higher rates of attrition, it stands to reason that we might see a spike in casualties around the same time. But just opening a new front alone wouldn't count for the sharpness of that spike, hence why others have fielded additional explanations. The New York Times, for example, notes that the Kremlin has been putting new recruits on the front lines relatively quickly. While this means a greater mass of infantry, it also means those soldiers are often poorly trained, resulting in more of them getting killed or wounded. This is especially the case when the battlefields, like always in Ukraine, are strewn with mines and under sweeping surveillance from drones. As the paper of record writes, quoting here, "Ubiquitous drones have made it easy for both sides to spot and target enemy forces, and mines and cluster munitions make movement across open grounds a nearly suicidal endeavor." Then there's the nature of Russia's assault groups, in which certain troops are intended to be expendable. The Telegraph has reported on, quote, meat assault units that are often made up of foot soldiers, released prisoners, and the maimed. In these groups, men walk forward, draw fire, so that those behind them know where Ukraine's forces are stationed. Or as the Telegraph explains it, many are simply protecting the next wave of soldiers behind as part of a tactic to distract and overwhelm Ukraine and make incremental territorial gains. The quote ends. And keyword in that sentence is incremental. While Russia is making advances, recently recapturing the village of Orezhane, for example, these advances are the very definition of slow. To see just how slow, we can look to the open source intelligence site WarMapper. By collating data from multiple sources, the project is able to give good estimates of how much territory has changed hands in any given month. In June, for example, WarMapper lists Russia as conquering 50 square kilometers. Back in May, as the Kharkiv offensive began, Moscow took slightly over 201 square kilometers, the Kremlin's largest monthly gain since January of 2023. Now, 201 square kilometers might sound like a lot, but as the site points out, it is equivalent to just 0.03% of Ukraine's landmass. Overall, despite all the slaughter, Russian control has remained at a pretty steady 18.5% of Ukraine since the autumn of 2022. Now, of course, not all territory is equally valuable, and some of Russia's recent gains have been either tactical or symbolic. On the symbolic side, Moscow has retaken villages that Ukraine liberated at great cost last summer, including Robotyne, the high watermark of Kyiv's disappointing counteroffensive. On the practical side, Russian soldiers are now closing in on Highway T0504 near Pokharovsk. Should they sever that road, Ukraine will lose a key resupply route to its forces in the Donbass. The question then isn't whether Moscow's forces are advancing, it's whether the advances are worth the cost in men and material, especially given MOD estimates that, quote, Russia's casualty rate will likely continue at an average of about 1,000 soldiers a day over the next 2 months, the quote ends. So far, this level of attrition has been sustainable thanks to a massive recruitment drive. US officials estimate that Russia is recruiting around 25 to 30,000 new soldiers monthly, although analysts like Michael Kaufman have cautioned that the number in more recent months is likely to be down the lower end of that range. However, there are signs that Moscow is struggling to sustain these numbers. The Jamestown Foundation has noted that signing bonuses for new recruits are getting larger and larger. By the end of May, one-off payments stood at 1.65 million rubles, or nearly $19,000. As the think tank writes, this is an especially attractive option for the people in the poorest regions of Russia, where this amount of money makes up several annual salaries. Inflated signing bonuses would strongly suggest Moscow is reacting to recent recruitment shortfalls. And while the pool of willing recruits clearly has yet to run dry, replacing the dead and injured is likely to only get harder. It's a similar story with tanks and other armored vehicles. So far in the war, Russia has accepted colossal armor losses as the price of capturing cities like Avdiivka. Open source intelligence site Oryx lists over 3,200 confirmed tanks lost on the Russian side. Western intelligence agencies estimate that at least 5,000 other armored vehicles have been destroyed. In a recent overview of Russian equipment losses, The Economist dove into the claim that Moscow's war machine was able to make up for it by producing new tanks. Using research from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, they estimated that Russia is currently capable of producing only 90 modern T-90M tanks a year, and that's only if you include upgrades of older T-90As. As far as completely new modern tanks are concerned, the true number produced may be closer to 30. The reason Moscow's forces have been able to sustain such a pace while producing relatively few tanks is due to a large Soviet-era stockpile that they can draw on. Hundreds of older T-72s and T-62s have been brought out of storage, refurbished, and sent into battle. As the magazine notes, though, huge though these stocks are, they are not infinite. While there may be over 3,000 tanks still in storage, many have been kept outside without maintenance since 1991. That means they could be in extremely poor condition. To quote The Economist's conclusion here, at current rates of attrition, Russian tank and infantry vehicle refurbishment from storage will have reached a critical point of exhaustion by the second half of next year. Given the major infantry losses that we're also seeing, it's tempting to wonder if there isn't a similar point of exhaustion for soldiers, a point where Russia will run out of willing men and have to either resort to another unpopular round of mobilization or narrow its war aims. After all, the 70,000 casualties in May and June are coming off the back of 2 full years where Moscow has lost soldiers on an epic scale. In a separate article to their tank piece, The Economist reported on leaked American documents which implied total Russian casualties, including both killed and wounded, could have been anywhere from 462,000 to 728,000 by mid-June. That's a higher estimate than many others are working with. In our last video on Russian losses, published in May, we reported on a statistical model Russian opposition outlets Meduza and Mediazona have developed to get an accurate count. Their data to March implied anywhere between 230 and 300,000 overall casualties. French and British intelligence, meanwhile, put the number closer to 500,000 killed and wounded. Yet even these smaller numbers would still be staggering. The lowest estimate of 230,000 killed and wounded is still over 4.5 times greater than the 50,000 killed and wounded during the Soviet-Afghan War. And those deaths were enough to shake the whole of Soviet society. But if you're watching this segment, hoping that protests similar to those that took place during the Soviet-Afghan War will soon rock Russia, it might have some bad news for you. Although the Ukraine war is killing and injuring ever-increasing numbers of Russians, they are sadly not the sort of Russians wider society is likely to care about. In a recent piece, Foreign Policy used Mediazona's data to argue that most Russians could remain apathetic about the war for a long time to come. Quoting them, "During the Afghanistan war, the Soviet Union sent regular conscripts to fight, and zinc coffins were seen in cities all over the USSR. In the Ukrainian war, Putin is careful to preserve the illusion of normalcy for the citizens of Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's the ethnic minorities and convicts that do most of the fighting." We can see this just by glancing at Mediazona's data, which lists the confirmed dead by the region that they come from. Since the list only features those dead whose identities have been confirmed, each number is likely a severe undercount, but they still tell a dreadful story. Moscow and St. Petersburg have both suffered around 570 war deaths, a little more than North Ossetia, which has seen 518. But North Ossetia's population is a mere fraction of that of the two cities. The Jamestown Foundation notes that this means Moscow has, quote, experienced one death per 23,000 people, while in North Ossetia, it's more like one death per 1,300. In other remote ethnic minority regions, it's even worse. Buryatia has seen one death for every 680 people, while in the Republic of Tuva, it's closer to one death for every 570 people. According to foreign policy, this unequal distribution of death is deliberate on Putin's part, an attempt to ensure the poor, the minorities, and the prisoners bear the brunt of his war of conquest, while the richer and more influential citizens living in the cities carry on living their lives as normal. As a result, even the staggering losses of the last couple of months are unlikely to change the Kremlin's calculations. Should another 70,000 casualties unfold across July and August, it may not make much difference. Still, Russia's supply of manpower, like its supply of armored vehicles, is not infinite. Even an army where life is cheap will eventually have to change tactics, especially since Putin wants to avoid a hugely unpopular general mobilization. The question then is when that point will come. Russia's gains may so far be modest this summer, but they are slowly taking territory, even if the cost of doing so is extraordinary. And while an influx of weapons and ammunition is allowing Ukraine to harden its defenses, Kyiv's forces remain disadvantaged. Right now, it remains to be seen just how far Russia's crawling gains will take it, and just how high a price Putin will be willing to pay to get there. A price to be paid in the blood of other people's fathers and sons. And for our next story, we travel to South America, where Venezuelans are preparing to vote in what could become their most important election in over a decade. July 28th. That's the date that's been set for Venezuela's vote. The date when 21 million citizens will go to the polls to pick their president. If this was a normal country, the result would be a foregone conclusion. After overseeing one of the planet's worst economic crises, the popularity of the current leader, Nicolas Maduro, isn't so much in the gutter as it is rapidly sinking into the sewer. Recent polls have put his approval ratings as low as a mere 25%. In a regular democracy, then, it's safe to say that Maduro would be staring down the barrel of a historic defeat. Surveys show 66% of voters want change. But of course, Venezuela isn't a regular democracy. It's an authoritarian regime, one which rigged the previous vote in 2018 so badly that the Organization of American States called it a farce. Now, 6 years later, the government seems to be trying similar tricks. The Economist reports that at least 37 opposition activists have been arrested this year. Back in January, the regime disqualified the popular opposition leader Maria Corina Machado from the ballot. Although she was replaced with the 74-year-old Edmundo Gonzalez Orisha, government goons routinely hassle anyone who attends his joint rallies with Machado, including tax authorities shutting down cafes that serve them refreshments. Maduro has even openly said that he doesn't plan to fight fair. The Center for Strategic and International Studies claims he told a rally that he would win por las buenas o por las malas, which the CSIS translates as by hook or by crook. Given all that, you might be tempted to think that the upcoming elections on July the 28th are a total sham, a window dressing on par with so-called elections in Russia or in North Korea. Yet that may not be the case. For the first time in over 10 years, Venezuelans might be about to vote in an election that is at least somewhat open and somewhat fair. The reason for this is something known as the Barbados Agreement. Signed in October of 2023 by the regime and opposition, it committed Caracas to holding fair elections in exchange for an easing of American sanctions on Venezuela's oil and gas industries. Importantly, though, this relaxation of sanctions came with a big undo button. As foreign policy explains, quoting here, if the Maduro government didn't stick to its commitments in Barbados, sanctions would snap back. This has created an incentive for the Venezuelan government to try and abide by the agreement, an incentive that's still in place at the time of writing. While the Biden White House reimposed some sanctions due to the disqualification of Maria Corina Machado, it did so with a light enough touch to hopefully convince Maduro to let the vote go ahead. You'll notice that we included a lot of vague phrasing in that last bit. Phrases like, at the time of writing, and words like, hopefully. And there's a reason for that. We're writing this on July the 18th, 10 days before the vote. That means there's plenty of time left for Maduro and his regime to try and pull a fast one and rig or cancel the election. And it's these fears of regime skullduggery that explain why this topic is, unfortunately, suitable for warographics, and that is because of the very real chance of unrest or violence surrounding the vote. The reasons for this aren't hard to fathom. Venezuela is a basket case. While people in the USA or Europe get upset at the state of their economies, people in Venezuela have suffered so much financial hardship that between a fifth and a quarter of them have fled the country. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, GDP has shrunk by 75% under Maduro, with over 80% of Venezuelans now living in poverty. The result of this, for a long time, was a surge in violent crime. From 2017 to 2022, Inside Crime reported that Venezuela has had the highest homicide rate in the whole of Latin America. By 2023, it had dropped down the list, below Ecuador, Haiti, and Honduras. But that doesn't mean life has necessarily gotten better for ordinary Venezuelans. In a recent deep dive piece, Inside Crime concluded that one reason for falling homicide rates is that the economic crisis was driving even the gangsters to flee abroad. Quoting here, "Economic decline in the labor and commercial sectors has left businesses and citizens unable to pay criminal groups, reducing opportunities for extortion and ransom kidnappings. A recession in Venezuela has led criminal gangs to infiltrate Venezuelan diasporas settled in other Latin American countries." Still, even with some criminal groups emigrating abroad in search of money, Venezuela remains a place where violence has become embedded. Not just gang violence, but also paramilitary violence from supporters of the government, known as colectivos, and from the government itself. Since 2013, the human rights organization Prever claims some 270 Venezuelans have been killed protesting against the regime. This means threats of election violence carry real weight here. Indeed, CNN reports that Maduro himself recently declared that he must win or Venezuela might, quote, fall into a bloodbath, into a fratricidal civil war. Exactly what form election violence could take is hard to say. It's also hard to separate out real threats from the regime's scaremongering, like Attorney General Tarek William Saab's recent claim that the opposition were plotting with Colombian paramilitaries. What we can say is that there exists a real potential for a massive crackdown following a rigged election, potentially similar to what we saw in Belarus in 2020. But there's also potential for violence to go in the other direction, against the government. Back in May, a serving general in Venezuela's army anonymously told reporter Sebastiana Barrios that, quote, "If the elections are stolen, I am sure that the Bolivian National Armed Forces will join civil disobedience." Although it might seem unlikely that the military would suddenly stand up to Maduro after all these years, the way the army is structured means we can't discount it. Unlike most armed forces, Venezuela's FANB is relatively decentralized. Individual commanders have their own power bases and loyalists. Should Maduro's presence become an issue following a rigged election, it's not impossible that someone might try to remove him. Perhaps a bigger worry, though, involves the border with Guyana, a small neighboring state with vast oil reserves. Now, if you watch this channel regularly, you'll likely remember the Guyana crisis. Back in December, Maduro abruptly organized a referendum to annex the region of Essequibo. For a few brief weeks, it looked like Caracas might be about to start South America's first interstate conflict since the Sinapa War in 1995. In the end, though, the annexation didn't go ahead. But as we've been reporting over the past few months, the potential still remains for a flare-up. Venezuela has expanded its military presence along the border, including stationing Iranian-built Zolfaga missile boats just 64 kilometers from Guyanese territory. So far, the build-up is far short of what Venezuela would need to pull off an invasion, but it could be enough to stage some sort of border incident, one that's dramatic enough for Maduro to declare a state of emergency and cancel the elections. Although this may sound like a conspiracy theory, there are serious analysts who believe Maduro might become desperate enough to try this. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has long been warning that sparking a border crisis with Guyana could give Maduro an easy escape from holding the vote. Here's how the think tank explained it in a recent paper. Maduro would order the armed forces to stage some kind of crisis with Guyana with the goal of provoking a reaction or planting a false flag. Under the guise of a state conflict, Maduro could declare that Venezuela does not have the requisite peace and stability domestically to hold elections, pointing to Ukraine as a country suspending elections during conflict. Such a plan would, of course, carry unbelievable risks. While Venezuela's military dwarfs Guyana's, the chances of escalation or things spinning out of control are absolutely enormous. Still, we shouldn't put it past Maduro to use every tool available to cling to power. Nor, it appears, would many Venezuelans. Recent polling by Venezuelan firm Mega-Analysis has suggested 40% of the population is thinking about emigrating should Maduro try to cling to power. However, we should point out that not everyone believes the elections are likely to end in either massive fraud, a crackdown, or some sort of violence. Slim as the chance is, there's also the possibility that Maduro will lose the elections so badly that he has no choice but to step aside. The Council on Foreign Relations explains that this is only likely to happen if the opposition, quote, presents him with a viable exit strategy. Maduro, after all, is wanted in the US on drug trafficking charges. There's a real threat, too, that the International Criminal Court's current investigation into Venezuela could result in an arrest warrant for crimes against humanity. Now, to his credit, Edmundo Gonzalez seems to recognize this. The opposition candidate has recently talked about issuing a possible amnesty for Maduro if he agrees to relinquish power. That could be enough to convince the autocrat it's safe to accept his loss. Sadly, it's an unlikely hope. Speaking to the New York Times, former director of Venezuelan intelligence Manuel Christopher Figuera declared, quote, Maduro knows that if he hands over power, although he could negotiate his exit, the rest of this criminal band could not. And so it seems that we're back where we were, stuck with an autocrat who seems destined to lose the upcoming election, but with no clear way to make him step aside after he does so. Exactly how Venezuela handles things on Sunday will therefore be interesting to see. A relatively fair election could indicate that Maduro is willing to cut a deal to step aside. A crackdown or flare-up on the Guyanese border could crush the last remaining hopes for Venezuela to ever return to democracy. The world may rightfully be fixated on America's election right now, but for its citizens at least, it could be that Venezuela's vote on July the 28th winds up being one of the most consequential elections of this entire year. And next up, we travel to the Gaza Strip, where after months upon months of airstrikes by the Israel Defense Force, or IDF, one massive strike is alleged to have dealt a crippling blow to the militant terror organization Hamas. The strike in question came on Saturday, July the 13th, in the southern Gaza Strip, and the target was one Mohammed Deif. Deif is an elusive figure within Gaza, and he always has been. Although he's been part of the organization for over 30 years, only 2 known photos of him have ever been taken, the most recent of which surfaced 24 years ago in the year 2000. His name is an alias. Born Mohammed Dab Ibrahim al-Masri, the name Deif literally translates to guest in Arabic. This refers to accounts of him, perhaps mythical, perhaps not, that suggest he stayed at a different house each night, every night, for years in order to evade Israel. He never, ever appears in public and only rarely creates audio recordings, including one that was broadcast on October 7th. He's become something of a legend within the Gaza Strip, having lost his eye, at least one of his legs, and his wife and 2 young children in pursuit of the Hamas cause, and dodging no fewer than 7 assassination attempts during his time with the organization. In Israel, he's long been dreaded as perhaps the most dangerous member of all within Hamas's ranks. It's Mohammed Deif, who served as Hamas's highest military commander for many years. It's Mohammed Deif, who is responsible for Hamas's network of tunnels, its prodigious bomb-making capabilities, and its many, many suicide bombings against Israelis over the years. And it's Deif who is regarded as one of the leading masterminds, and in fact, the highest architect, behind the Hamas terror assault of October the 7th, 2023, and the nearly year-long insurgency that Hamas has been fighting ever since. But at least according to the IDF and the Israeli government, Deif's life came to a sudden end last Saturday, July 13th, when his suspected position within Gaza came under massive assault by Israeli warplanes. The strike took place in a designated humanitarian zone on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, a refugee area in the small, formerly Bedouin town of Mawasi, near the Gazan city of Khan Yunis. Per journalistic and eyewitness accounts, the strike may have involved somewhere between 5 and 8 missiles, including some targeting first responders at the scene. According to the Wall Street Journal, publishing on July the 16th, people familiar with the operation have indicated that no fewer than 8 precision-guided 2,000-pound bombs were used in the attack. The New York Times has since reviewed video and photo of the incident and verified that Israel launched at least one airstrike in the immediate vicinity of emergency responders during the assault, killing and injuring multiple first responders. Mawasi is densely populated, especially in its designated humanitarian areas, and as missiles rain down, a number of civilians are known to have been killed. Reporters for the Associated Press camped out at the nearby Nasser hospital counted at least 40 bodies transported there in the aftermath of the strike, while the Gaza Health Ministry, run by Hamas but usually presenting figures that go on to be mostly verified by third-party organizations, claimed at least 91 people dead and no fewer than 300 others wounded. Women and children were among the dead. Quoting from France 24 now, Footage of the aftermath showed a huge crater, charred tents, and burnt-out cars. Victims were carried on the hoods and in the hatchbacks of cars and on donkey carts and carpets. According to one doctor interviewed by the BBC while dealing with the wounded, a majority of patients have experienced multiple shrapnel wounds, including numerous civilians and many women and children. The IDF, however, has published aerial photos of the site, claiming that the location it bombed was not a complex of tents, but a Hamas compound where several militants were keeping guard over Daif. According to the IDF, quote, additional terrorists hid among civilians. But whether the strike actually resulted in the death of Mohammed Daif is less clear. According to the IDF, Daif wasn't the only target of the strike. Apparently, he was in the same location as one Rafa Salama, the commander of the Hamas brigade in the city of Khan Yunis. Salama is described by the IDF as another of the architects behind the October 7th attacks. Per Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, though, the aftermath of the strike did not result in a clear answer as to whether Daif had been killed. Per the IDF, Rafa Salama was successfully eliminated, a claim that Hamas has since confirmed. Netanyahu insisted that even in the event of a failure, Israel would not be deterred. Quoting him here, "Either way, we will get the whole of the leadership of Hamas." But at the time of writing, Hamas still denies that Daif was killed and insists that he is in good health, although the group has produced no evidence to support that claim. Hamas has even claimed that Israel had only said Daif and Salama were present at all in order to justify the attack on Mawasi. An expert on target and civilian casualty assessment interviewed by the New York Times didn't directly endorse that idea, but noted that even if Daif and Salama weren't present, Israel might have signed off on both the attack and then the follow-up strike that hit emergency vehicles. Quoting him here, any Hamas targets carry enough military necessity that any civilian loss is considered proportional. Or at least that's per Israel's logic. At the time it occurred, the strike was the deadliest single Israeli attack on Gaza within several weeks, if the casualty counts of the Gaza Health Ministry are to be trusted. The strike drew yet more condemnation for Israel from much of the world. The leader of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, expressed shock at the deaths of civilians and emphasized that, quote, nowhere is safe in Gaza during an Israeli campaign that the UN strongly suggests is in violation of humanitarian law. Egypt too weighed in on its neighbor nation, condemning both the strike itself and the, quote, shameful silence and lack of action from the international community. A prominent representative of the European Union called for an independent probe into the incident, and per the US Department of Defense, the country's defense secretary spoke with Israel's defense minister to reiterate the need to minimize civilian harm during its combat operations. But the next anticipated casualty of the Israeli strike, an ongoing peace process that many international observers expected to fall apart in the aftermath, still remains ongoing. According to Egyptian sources helping to broker ceasefire negotiations, those negotiations were paused after the incident, cutting short a series of apparently intense talks that, according to those same sources, revealed, quote, internal discord within the Israeli government on how to proceed. Hamas claims to still be committed to ceasefire discussions despite the strike, although it claims that Israel's recent strike shows that the nation is not interested in actually reaching a settlement to end the fighting. Netanyahu also took the opportunity Saturday night, just hours after the airstrike in Mawasi, to insist that Israel was still engaged with the ceasefire framework proposed by the United States. At the time of writing, neither side has been able to conclusively prove the fate of Mohammed Daif. Nonetheless, the negotiations between Israel and Hamas still persist, with both sides under international pressure to accept a deal, but under internal pressure to bring their side and their people a clear victory in the conflict. According to sources interviewed by Bloomberg for an article published on July 17th, negotiations still focus on several key problem areas, including decisions over which hostages would be released in the first phase of a ceasefire, the status of Hamas in northern Gaza, and the ability of Israel to maintain a troop presence in southern areas, among others. In recent days, Hamas has offered a major concession, suggesting that it would give up civilian governance of Gaza while insisting that it would still maintain its military wing. But that's likely not enough. The Netanyahu government has vowed again and again to destroy Hamas's military infrastructure and kill each of its leaders, despite the difficult political reality that Hamas, as a deeply entrenched asymmetric insurgency, might be impossible to eradicate without completely leveling the Gaza Strip to the ground. Meanwhile, sources interviewed by the Jerusalem Post have renewed accusations that Netanyahu is, quote, actively sabotaging any deal that could see hostages released. Also revealed by J-Post are allegations that Israel may have had opportunities to strike Hamas's highest leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, but has avoided doing so because of a high-ranking risk of hitting hostages by whom Sinwar is always surrounded as human shields. For the time being, the status of Mohammed Deif remains unclear, as does the status of the entire Israel-Hamas war. Despite incalculable human suffering on both sides, despite the devastation of the Gaza Strip, and despite the clear presence of an off-ramp that would require difficult but necessary concessions from both sides, the war continues. In fact, Israel has found itself having to shift troops northward en masse, most recently by way of a renewed offensive in Gaza City. On July the 11th, prior to the strike on Deif, Israel ordered Palestinians to evacuate Gaza City and move southward, thus announcing a shift back to a part of Gaza that the IDF had already reduced largely to rubble and declared cleared of Hamas. In the days after, the IDF dropped hundreds of thousands of leaflets in the ruined city urging people to move, and the IDF has now renewed its airstrikes in the area. On the morning of Sunday, July the 14th, at least 31 Palestinians were reported dead and 50 or more wounded, with most killed in Gaza City. Other targets in central Gaza have come under renewed attack again, including in another strike, also on the 14th, that killed 14 people near a UN-run school that had been converted into a shelter for displaced people. Overnight leading into July the 16th, another 60 or more Palestinians were claimed dead, including more who were killed by strikes into designated safe zones where Israel itself instructed Palestinians to seek refuge. Israel claims that the strikes are carried out to eliminate Hamas militants who were recently flushed out of parts of the organization's tunnel networks, especially in northern Gaza, where again Israel had already cleared and moved on months ago. The following day, July 17th, the Gaza Health Ministry alleged that yet more strikes had killed another 81 Palestinians or more and wounded nearly 200 at a bare minimum. According to both the Gaza Health Ministry and independent outlets, many more women and children have been killed in the most recent waves. All the while, Hamas has been able to continue launching anti-tank rockets, mortars, and small arms fire at IDF troops and fire occasional rocket barrages into Israel. If anything is clear at this stage of the conflict, it's that the relief that will end the bloodshed must come from high up within both Israel and Hamas. On the ground, the situation is settling into another grim rhythm. Hamas fighters scatter into asymmetric insurgency that could take years or even decades to uproot, and the IDF chases them wherever they go. For the fighters on the ground, each successive firefight, tank advance, mortar explosion, and airstrike are all part of the same rhythm. Fighters who are shot at will shoot back, and fighters who are given orders from on high will execute them faithfully. That the fighters on both sides still engage in such incredible violence has far less to do with the choices they've made as individuals and far more to do with the leaders of both Israel and Hamas, who elect to continue this engagement rather than sue for peace. Without change there, relief is unlikely to come anytime soon. And in our final story of the week, we turn our attention to Ukraine, where the forces of Kyiv have achieved a small but highly symbolic victory on the Isthmus of Crimea. Annexed illegally by Russia since 2014 and long used as a forward operations base for the fearsome Black Sea Fleet out of the Crimean port city of Sevastopol, the peninsula has been exceptionally difficult for Ukraine to get back, but has taken on a life of its own as a sort of ultimate prize that could lead to a larger cascade of defeats across Russia's warfront. The symbolic victory in question came on July 15th when the Ukrainian Navy announced that Russia's last naval patrol vessel based on Crimea had finally left. Said a Navy spokesman on Facebook, quoting here, "The last patrol ship of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation is bolting from our Crimea just now. Remember this day." The ship is the last in a long line of reassignments by Moscow, with every combat-ready warship that had once occupied Crimea now having vacated the area. As that same naval spokesman explained, the decision to have this last patrol vessel depart is likely an attempt to transition it to a new base for the long term, as Russia has long since stopped sending ships to travel through the open waters of the Black Sea for no reason. The vessel itself wasn't too terribly much to look at, either for Russian leaders looking for a way to use it in the war or for Ukrainian troops looking for a reason to fear it. One of 4 remaining Krivock-class frigates in Russian service, it's an aging vessel first laid down in the 1970s, with 35 of the 40 ever built now having been retired from service. Displacing about 3,300 tons and measuring 123.5 meters or 405 feet from bow to stern, it's a decent maritime threat in a head-to-head contest with other warships. It hits a top speed of 32 knots, it's equipped to engage in electronic warfare, and it carries up to 80 surface-to-air missiles, 4 anti-ship missiles, and 8 torpedo tubes on board. But it, just like every other warship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, has proven broadly unable to deal with an onslaught of Ukrainian attacks against it. Ukraine has no major warships, and much of what it did have at the start of the current war was scuttled to keep it out of Russian hands. But what Ukraine can leverage are a range of anti-ship missiles, aerial drones, and highly innovative sea drones. We've actually published a recent episode all about those sea drones, so do check out that if you're interested. According to Ukraine, the nation has destroyed or damaged no fewer than 27 Russian Navy vessels since the start of the current war, including a minesweeping warship destroyed in Crimea in May, which Ukraine had claimed was the last remaining warship in Crimea armed with cruise missiles. The departure of this final warship from Crimea is again only a symbolic victory. For all intents and purposes, Crimea is no easier for Ukraine to take today than it was before the warship left. But the symbolism behind Ukraine's small victory isn't just the fact that they've given Russia yet another proud middle finger, although to be clear, they've certainly done that too. Instead, it's yet another indicator of a much broader change that's been going on around Crimea, that although the isthmus was once considered an immense strategic asset for Russia, it's now becoming a clear strategic liability. Even worse for Russian President Vladimir Putin and his war planners, that liability is looking less and less like a simple, stinging failure to make anything out of the isthmus, and more like a vulnerability that places the entire Russian war effort at risk. Ukraine's newfound ability to encroach on Crimea stems from its acquisition of long-awaited American-made missiles, ATACMS, that have enabled more frequent, more accurate, and more damaging strikes against Russian targets on the peninsula. Ukraine had been setting the table for a higher volume of strikes for quite some time in advance, working to soften the peninsula's naval assets with its sea drones and launching occasional strikes to take out what infrastructure there it could. But with the introduction of the ATACMS missiles fired from HIMARS missile launchers and capable of making tight turns to evade air defenses, Ukraine has been able to do a whole lot more. At this stage, there are two types of target within Crimea that are of ultimate importance for Ukraine: air defense systems and radar installations. With the addition of the ATACMS missile, Ukraine has been more able to destroy both. In one wave of attacks, announced on June the 10th, for example, Ukraine claimed to have damaged a Russian S-400 missile defense system in Crimea, plus two less advanced S-300s, without a single missile interception from what Ukraine mockingly referred to in a Telegram statement as, quote, the enemy's highly effective air defenses. Since then, Ukraine claims to have damaged or destroyed no fewer than 15 Russian long-range air defense systems, including more S-400s and S-300s. Satellite imagery has confirmed damage to several systems, as well as to the critical radar installations that warn of incoming attacks and help to coordinate air defense. According to US officials, Ukraine has enough ATACMS at its disposal to keep up this rate of attacks indefinitely, with the US willing to replenish their stocks continually. And just as important is the ATACMS range, meaning that now all of Crimea is in range to be hit by Ukrainian forces, not just the more limited stretches of territory that Ukraine had previously been able to threaten. The destruction of air defense systems and radar installations are so important to Ukraine for two primary reasons. On the one hand, those are the mechanisms by which Russia is able to see Ukrainian attacks coming, be they by drone, missile, or something else, and bring them down before they strike other targets. That defensive capability basically puts a protective dome around all the other critical land-based assets still positioned on Crimea. On the other hand, there are also the mechanisms by which Russia could target other Ukrainian assets, say, for example, a certain American-made fourth-generation fighter aircraft. With every S-300 and S-400 destroyed and every radar station incapacitated, Russia's ability to defend Crimea becomes that much more spotty in its reliability, that much slower to respond, and that much more patchy in its overall coverage. And even missile systems that are just damaged may be out of the fight for a while, given Russia's apparent slowness in repairing military hardware that's taken damage over the course of this war. In order to fix the issue, Russia can send more missile defense systems, but if it can't actually stop Ukraine's strikes with the ATACMS, it's just putting more systems in danger. But the alternative is even worse: ceding the ability to protect Crimea and simply accepting that the onslaught of Ukrainian missiles can't be stopped. One way or the other, Ukraine's eventual goal is to degrade Crimea's air defense apparatus enough that it ceases to be a threat for Ukrainian drones, missiles, and even aircraft. And if Ukraine can achieve that, then Russian assets on Crimea, to use the technical term, are royally screwed. Russia keeps major military power on Crimea: large fuel depots, land assets like tanks and heavy fighting vehicles, air bases with significant numbers of fighter aircraft stationed there, and of course, the highly symbolic and strategically critical Kerch Strait Bridge. That bridge, in particular, is a likely future Ukrainian target, and Russia knows it. In recent weeks, Russia has been observed over satellite imagery taking extensive steps to fortify the bridge against attack. Not only is the bridge critical to keep supply lines to Crimea open, but it's iconic for Russia's occupation, both in Kiev and in Moscow. And not just Russia, but Ukraine too, appear to be putting all of its chips on the Kerch Strait Bridge. Over the last few months, Russia has used ferries and naval vessels to send things like fuel and ammunition, highly explosive if targeted, and gotten them to Crimea without putting them on the bridge. But Ukraine's first attack and strikes took care to devastate the landing ships and the ferries used for those operations, and now Crimea's ports are entirely unguarded. That traffic is being forced back onto the bridge, just in time for Ukraine to strike it with a level of precision and a level of impunity that goes beyond what the country has ever achieved in this war. And just as Crimea is looking more vulnerable than ever, Ukraine's newest toy is very, very close to arriving in its arsenal. According to statements made by the US Secretary of State during the recent NATO summit in Washington, D.C., Ukraine's first transfer of F-16s from the Netherlands and Denmark is scheduled to arrive during this summer, with the final transfer process already underway. That's in addition to a whole raft of dozens of air defense systems NATO nations pledged to send Ukraine over the next several months, keeping those aircraft safe on Ukrainian soil. In another bit of news just hours old at the time of writing, the NATO member nation of Greece is about to decommission another 32 F-16s and sell them to the US, where they'll be upgraded and transferred to Ukraine, thus raising the total count of the aircraft northward of 100. And all of these are set to arrive in the next few years. While Ukraine is still low on pilots for the aircraft, the F-16s themselves are expected to be abundant in the country sooner than later. And when it comes to Crimea, F-16s are a tool that, if used correctly, could likely turn the tide. It's unlikely that the aircraft would be streaking above Sevastopol themselves, dropping bombs at close range and dogfighting with Russian MiGs. Instead, their true utility is as a sort of weapons truck, launching medium and long-range weapons from the air and cascading them down to Crimean targets. A few months ago, such a tactic would have been basically useless. But now, with Crimea's air defense systems softening, it's a whole lot more feasible for F-16s to start running those missions as soon as they enter combat roles. With its onboard radar and its AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, the F-16 will be able to engage air-to-air targets at a range of 180 kilometers, way outside the range of most of Russia's aircraft, and perhaps more likely, they're going to use air-to-surface cruise missiles to destroy those aircraft on the ground. Already, the long range of the F-16 meant that it was unlikely that they'd ever have to get within range of Russia's air defenses in order to have an impact. Worst comes to worst, their cruise missiles or other munitions might have been shot out of the sky, but if Ukraine really has degraded Crimean air defense and continues to do so, then even that is unlikely. We should emphasize here that even Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has been open about the fact that the number of aircraft sent to Ukraine in 2024 won't be enough to put Ukraine on par with the Russian Air Force or turn the tide of frontline trench battles in Ukraine's east. But at least in Crimea, that's not the point anyhow, and the impact that even 1 or 2 or 3 F-16s can have, flying frequent sorties and slipping weapons past Russian air defenses, simply cannot be overstated. As a June article from The Economist explains, quoting here, a D-Day-style amphibious assault to liberate Crimea remains inconceivable. Regardless of just how degraded Russian defenses and assets are on the peninsula, launching a mass attack on Crimea to take it back appears to be an idea that's simply outside the realm of Ukraine's current capabilities. The troop and equipment investment needed to pull off such a thing isn't really achievable, with Ukraine stretched too thin already across its long front lines. But storming Crimea and taking back the land itself is less important right now as a strategic priority than it may seem. Far more meaningful is Ukraine's ability to target all the costly and important materials that Russia has positioned there to impose massive costs on Moscow and add to Vladimir Putin's list of reasons why it may be better to sue for peace rather than continuing the war. This week, Ukraine only got an inch closer by evicting the last remnants of the Black Sea Fleet. But that news comes at a time when a cascade of bad news in Crimea seems increasingly inevitable. With every S-400 destroyed, every ATACMS that lands a successful strike, and every F-16 that eventually takes to the skies, a collapse of Russian Crimea comes closer and closer by the day. And if there's anything that could fundamentally disrupt Russia's calculus at this moment in Putin's ruinous war, well, that would be it.